Hi, I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville. Welcome to this week's edition of Kibbitzing with Kagan, brief conversations with people I find fascinating. Today's special guest is John Berkon. He is a national election lawyer with the Elias Group, which is one of the most respected Democratic election law firms. John, thank you so much for taking time to chat today.
Thank you for having me, Senator. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, just for folks who don't know your background, just so they know your credentials, you were cum laude undergraduate at Yale, and then got your law degree magna cum laude from Harvard. So we've got to just start with the you're a smart guy and you
Thank you.
do
I
election law.
appreciate it. I appreciate
Okay.
it.
So, as a partner at the Elias Group, you work for a lot of democratic causes and organizations. The firm represents the Democratic Governors Association, the Democratic Attorney Generals Association, the Democratic Legislative Campaign Committee, yay, that's for state legislators, Secretary of States, and all that. Tell me the sort of cases that you all take on. And I have a million questions we're going to go through.
Excellent. So it's best to kind of think of what we do in two pieces. We have lawyers like me who day to day are helping candidates, legislators, other elected officials structure their campaigns, political parties structure their work, political action committees, and other nonprofits structure their work to do so in a way that allows them to achieve what it is they want to achieve, whether that's electing Democrats, passing progressive legislation, doing other educational work for the public in a legally permissible way. And so that's what I focus my day to day on most of the time. Then we have a whole other group of litigators who are in court primarily focused on redistricting and voting rights
Yes.
litigation.
We are totally going to talk about both of those.
Excellent.
But before we get to that, how did you start in election law? What interested you in that, and what was the journey?
So the journey for me, I was a political nerd, political in my politics in my blood in college. I think the formative experience of my early college experience was the Bush v. Gore election, and how couldn't you become an election law, focused
Yes,
person after living through that experience. So
yes.
I did, volunteered on campaigns and took a lot of classes, really into it. And so after college, my first job after college, I had interned actually for Senator Schumer while I was in college as well. So that was
Yay.
a great
Chuck
experience.
Schumer, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader.
Absolutely. And he was a first term senator back then before he became the majority leader, but was obviously on the rise. And I loved my experience on Capitol
Yes.
Hill. It was actually the summer before 9/11. And it was it seemed like the last summer where there was still a lot of bipartisan work getting done. They passed campaign finance reform. I think they passed like the Patient's Bill of Rights, which was a big issue back then. So it seemed like a lot was getting done. Obviously, a lot changed on 9/11.
Right.
And right after college, I went to work on Joe Lieberman's presidential campaign as a field organizer in New
Okay.
Hampshire. So once I did that,
Former U.S.
politics
Senator
and
from
budget.
Connecticut.
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
was had been the vice presidential nominee with Al Gore in 2000.
Yes.
So I worked on that campaign. And when that was over, he did not win the Democratic nomination. I came to Washington, D.C., where I luckily landed a job with Diane Feldman, who is a Democratic pollster,
Yes. Yep.
and had worked for kind of Stan Greenberg and was one of the real original Democratic pollsters as polling became a dominant, force within Democratic politics and a real trailblazer.
Diane and I go back 30 something years,
There you
actually.
go. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I worked with Diane for a year plus before law school. And when I went to law school, I did all the law school stuff, but I kind of always knew I think I'd be back in politics. And to find a job where you get to still be a lawyer and do politics, that was
Perfect.
kind of the perfect combo for me.
Perfect. Um, so elections have been so much more in the news than they ever used to be. So why don't you start with how you see the state of the landscape right now, how Donald Trump changed things. Talk about conspiracy theories, like where are we right now with people voting and people's attitudes towards our elections?
I think the dominant feature in my career from when I really started doing this at Perkins Coie. That was the law firm before the Elias Law Group, in 2010 through now. The two dominant things that have happened. The first is the explosion of money in politics.
Yeah.
So in about my third week at Perkins Coie, the Supreme Court handed down Citizens United.
Right.
And
which was a court case that did what?
So there was a court case that basically said that as long as a group is spending their money independently, they can take unlimited contributions from any domestic source. So no longer would you be limited to only getting, $5,000 from a donor, or $10,000 from a donor. You could take $1 million. You could take $10 million. A corporation could write a $20 million check to you. And that fundamentally both changed who was participating in politics, but it just increased the volume. The sheer amount of money that was spent on politics changed a lot then, and it's through this day. And the other piece, which I think is we've seen a lot in the last 7 years, really since Trump came on the scene, is how much voting has been contested. Right? It used to be, I think, relatively, at least for a period of time, a given that people could vote. The election night, the winner on election was determined when you were watching TV and you see who had more votes. And now every step of the process is a fight, is contested. Who can vote, whether they can continue to vote after having been convicted of a felony, after they move, whether if you mismark something on your absentee ballot envelope, whether that's going to get thrown out, whether the day after the election, if your candidate has more votes, are they going to go look to try and find votes to disqualify them or say the election shouldn't be certified? And so at some level for us, that means we have to be so focused on every stage of the process, because every stage of the process is so contested. And that is really a major difference than it was 6 or 7 years ago.
Do we have safe, secure, and accurate elections, John?
Yes.
In America, 100%. No disclaimer there.
I look, I think with any process, there are going to be small mistakes and errors, undoubtedly, right? Anything you do. But the election results are remarkably accurate. And I think you can determine that based on anytime there actually is a recount or an audit that's done. The changes that result from that are minuscule. They are, never statistically significant, and they're well within the margin of error. And I think that should give people confidence that the results they see on election night and, soon thereafter are accurate.
So the way people have voted has changed over the years. It used to be that we all went to the polls in our neighborhood on election day. And then we did early voting. We have election day registration. If you missed a deadline, there's no such thing. You can come in and register and vote, and then mail-in ballots. So why don't you talk about the different methods? And I'm curious to know how you personally vote.
It's a great question. I'll start with the latter first. During the pandemic, I voted by mail, as many people did, as we were trying to minimize our contact outside. Now, and before the pandemic, I almost always vote early in person.
That's what I do. Me too.
Virginia, I live in Virginia. Virginia now has a very long 45-day.
Crazy long.
Early voting period, which is great. Before, back in the day, you needed to have an excuse to vote absentee, whether by mail or in person in Virginia. I think prior to about 2019, that was the case.
In Maryland too, just because we're mostly being watched in Maryland.
Exactly. So you
had to say I'm out of town or I'm in a hospital, or you had to have excuses. And now then it was no excuse absentee.
Exactly. So I think both rules changed about the similar period of time. But for me, as an election lawyer, I'm always busy on election day. So I always had a valid excuse, because if you were out of the county a number of hours in a day, and I always was, right? I was like starting work at 5 a.m. that day, and just I was gone out of Virginia. So I was always able to always able to do that. And you are exactly right. The way that elections are administered, really, you can think of it as 3 different streams of voting. So vote by mail for those who haven't done it. You apply to get a mail ballot. They send you a ballot in the mail.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second. We have also had mail-in ballots. You don't have to request. in Maryland during COVID, in the primary of 2020, every voter, every registered voter was sent a ballot. That's the way Rockville has done it. In Gaithersburg, you still have to request it. It's a mishmash still.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know they did that in New Jersey and Nevada and other states, which was I think, a great thing that was done during the pandemic. And in Virginia, you can also be on the permanent absentee ballot list, so you can
Yes,
request
here
in every
too.
election versus in some
Mhm.
elections. But yeah, you get however the request comes, you get a ballot in the mail, and depending on the state, uh, you have to typically fill out an envelope associated with that mail ballot, and the rules are a little bit different in every state. In
Yep.
North Carolina, you need 2 witnesses. In Virginia, which is I think it's the only 2 witness state, right? You need two
Dang.
witnesses, right? Which is
So we
yeah,
just have to sign the oath that says, this is my ballot, I'm filling it out. And you've done work on curing, and so have I. But why don't we get back to that in a second? Keep going through
yeah.
the options of how to vote.
Absolutely. And so now in Virginia, we used to have a 1 witness requirement. It was a bipartisan compromise to get rid of the 1 witness requirement. In exchange for that, though, you have to put your last 4 digits of your social security number on your ballot envelope and your year of birth. That's the form of identification. Yeah. But every state's different. And I strongly support the way Maryland does it, which is simply you certify like you do for anything else, which reduces the number of errors. So that mail balloting has, is popular, and depending on the state can comprise a pretty large percent of the vote.
Yes.
Early voting in most places is essentially, rather than having like, your school in your neighborhood or community center and having a bunch of different places, depending on the state, you may have, 1 location per county or 5 locations per county, or you guys may have,
We have tons, and they
tons,
have
yeah.
to be metro accessible, mass transit accessible if that's possible, ADA accessible for people with disabilities. There are a lot of requirements, but they are centrally located community centers, senior centers,
Yeah.
schools, and people go to vote there early at their convenience.
Yeah, which makes a huge difference. So
Yes,
you can vote. A lot of the fights that we have are typically to expand weekend voting hours, which
yeah,
makes it easier for a lot of people to vote. Sunday voting hours, particularly important in the Black community to
yep,
get the vote out. So
yep,
that's the early and mail, and then you have your traditional election day vote, right? Where it's
right.
you go to your local polling location on election day during election day hours and vote.
Yes.
And look, it's fascinating because depending on the state, you often have more than 50% of the vote that is cast before election day.
Right.
It depends, and very different state by state, but that is often the case, that a significant chunk of the vote happens before election day.
So I passed a bill. Maryland was the only state that did not allow mail-in ballots to be processed, counted, canvassed until after election day, which was crazy. And so, especially in a close race, it was really a problem, and that could cause a loss of voter confidence. And so, unfortunately, former Republican Governor Larry Hogan vetoed it 2 years ago, and last year Governor Westmore proudly signed it so that we can start processing our mail-in ballots, which are an increasing percentage of the total vote cast, as you just indicated.
I commend you
Let's
for
talk.
that. I think that's such an
Thank you.
important, and to your earlier question about voter confidence, I do think, despite what I said and me having seen the insides of it and can vouch for the fact that it's really done well, I do think that not having a result really close to after the election happens does decrease voter confidence, whether justified or not, it just does, and we need to address that.
So one of the challenges, and I think the Republicans messed this up badly, is the Republicans were raising doubts about the wisdom of voting with a mail-in ballot. And since mail-in ballot data wasn't coming in sometimes until later, the election results changed. And so Democratic candidates who were trailing ended up pulling it out and winning once the mail-in ballots were counted. Do you want to address? And now they're trying to pivot and come back. As a Democratic lawyer, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, it is clear that Donald Trump made it a deliberate strategy, whether smart or not. I don't think it was smart for his side, but that's what he chose to
Hmm.
discourage his folks from voting by mail during
Right.
2020. demonize mail voting. And as a result, we saw a method of voting that prior to 2020 really did not skew one way or another part. In some states, in fact, skewed Republican. It had historically been kind of something aimed in California and Florida at actually wealthier Republican voters.
Yeah.
But in 2020, we saw just massive disparities. Like if you look, I was in Pennsylvania after the election in 2020, and in Pennsylvania, Democrats won Pennsylvania does not have in-person early. So you either have mail balloting or you have election day voting. And Biden lost the election day vote, something like 2-1 across the state, but won the mail vote. He either got somewhere between 75 and 80% of the mail vote. So you essentially had two different elections. And as you said, Pennsylvania also had a rule where they were not processing the mail ballots until election day. So you didn't have it counted by election day. So that's why you saw Trump up.
Yeah,
he gets out victory, and the votes get counted. They get counted in the middle of the night. People get up. The results are different than when they're in bed. And naturally, if you ask questions. But the reality is that was just the different times when those votes were counted. And when you have partisan disparities on different vote streams, it exacerbates the problem that you discuss in terms of voter confidence.
Agreed. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but curing is something that people are confused by. So in Maryland, I have to sign the oath on the outside of the envelope. Once that is registered as having been received, my mail-in ballot, the envelope with my signature and my ballot are separated, never to be brought together again, so that there is confidentiality. But oops, I forgot to sign the oath. That ballot, in order to be counted, must be cured. And my legislation gave all sorts of options, and it's phone, fax, letter, email, fax, all in person, all different ways of making sure that we can count your ballot so that you can fix it and be part of democracy. You did some great work in, I think it was North Carolina, on curing. Why don't you talk briefly just about that?
Yeah, and again, I just want to commend you on that legislation because it is so important to ensure that people's the right to vote. The right to vote is not just casting your ballot. It is that your ballot, if you are a valid voter, that ballot gets counted. Without it being counted, it's not a real vote. You don't have equality with other people. North Carolina, in part due to its witness requirements, had enormously high rejection rates. In 2018, North Carolina's the rejection rate for mail ballots was 6.1%. So 6.1% of people who returned their mail ballot had that ballot rejected for some sort of deficiency, usually involving, witness not putting their address correctly. In the primary in 2020, this was right kind of as COVID was outbreaking, the rejection rate was over 9%. Like almost 1 out of 10 people who voted were not
crazy.
It's just like massive disenfranchisement. And again, these are, just to be clear with folks, these are people who are bona fide voters who are absolutely qualified and registered to vote and every right
legal vote.
They haven't done anything wrong. They just kind of didn't fill out a form right. I mean, if you think about, you fill out something for your kid's school, or you go to the doctor's office and you give them the form and they're like, oh, you forgot to fill that part out. Right? And you're right there and they tell you fill it. Oh, okay. Imagine a world in which you messing up a form meant that you didn't get like health insurance or health care. Your kid didn't get lunch at school, right? That was just like an absolute, like no one would tolerate that. Yet in a world without curing, that's what happens with voting. So in North Carolina, we put together it was just an incredible investment. The Biden campaign and DGA and Cooper and DLCC and DAG and all these other folks who had interest.
Democratic Governors Association.
Yeah, sorry, the Democratic Governors Association. We had Governor Cooper running again. We had Josh Stein running for Attorney General. We had the legislature, in play. We had a U.S. Senate race, House races. So it was a massive voter enfranchisement effort. And the way that curing works essentially is people start voting. The state will publish a list that basically says, okay, this person voted, their ballot is good to go, right? It gets separated.
And to be clear, if you vote in person or if you voted early voting in person, there is no challenge with curing. This is only relevant for mail-in ballots because they will say, it just isn't a thing. Okay, I've got a ton more to cover here. Let's talk about
in the end, the rate fell below 1% for the general election.
Yes, amazing. Congratulations.
People get to vote. Yeah, it was really great for the voters. Absolutely.
Yes. So let's talk about the Supreme Court. On the date that we are taping this, the Supreme Court is hearing another case, and they have ruled in Alabama. There's now a case in South Carolina when Republican legislatures are drawing maps that are so skewed that even this conservative Trump Supreme Court are saying this is absurd, and courts at different levels are requiring redrawing. Talk about the Supreme Court and other courts' role in redistricting and what a lot of folks call gerrymandering or gerrymandering, as it's supposed to be called. But the partisan or racially based drawing of state or congressional lines.
Yeah, and it's such an important issue. And the Voting Rights Act, which is one of the most important pieces of legislation that's been passed in the last 100 years, guarantees equal participation in the electoral process. And over time, courts recognize and Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act to guarantee that voters would have that Black voters and Latino voters would have an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice, right? And it doesn't guarantee equal outcomes, just an opportunity to elect your candidate of choice. And what has been done in many Republican legislatures is to draw lines to deny primarily Black voters an opportunity to elect their candidate of choice. And what the court recognized in the Alabama case was that the Voting Rights Act still applies with equal force to the drawing of maps, and the traditional tests used to determine whether or not voters had an opportunity to elect their candidates of choice still was good law. This was a conservative court that still upheld this, and it was clear that Alabama's map failed that test.
Let me just explain to folks, when you keep talking about have the opportunity to elect the candidate of their choice. So of course they have the opportunity to vote for them, but if there's Black area, neighborhood, city, and rather than having that as a congressional district with some surrounding stuff, if it's cut in half or thirds or fourths, then it dilutes the voting power. And so the people of color who live there, who might have similar attitudes and interests and needs in their elected representatives, don't have the opportunity because they are basically, their views are watered down and divided. So just to be clear so that folks know why this matters so much.
No, absolutely. And the only way that you can successfully bring a racial gerrymandering claim under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is to demonstrate that there is racial block voting, right? So in areas, let's say, in Maryland, right, where you have districts that have, a lot of diverse districts, you have Black voters, white voters, and if white voters are actually supporting candidates who are also the Black voters' candidates of choice over a period of time, you can't even bring a Voting Rights Act claim, right? It's only in areas where there is that demonstrated block voting, and that's where you have the real constitutional harm to Black voters.
What's the worst thing that the Supreme Court or other courts could do? What are you fearing most coming in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the litigation that was brought and my firm played a big role, particularly in the Alabama case, but also in the Morby Harper case in North Carolina. I think those two wins averted the things that we were most concerned about, right? The complete gutting of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. For now, that has been averted. And then the independent state legislature doctrine in Morby Harper, just to explain for folks, that was the theory that was articulated on the right that gained a lot of steam during the 2020 election, that basically said that in a federal election, only state legislatures had the authority to set the rules for
we have so many rabbit holes we could go down here, and we have to watch the time a little bit because people are not going to watch a 4-hour podcast or listen to one. And I have a lot more questions. So, oh my golly, biggest tip, biggest tactic, most effective tactic to increase voter registration, voter participation, voter turnout that you've seen?
I think expanding vote by mail and same day registration. is the biggest thing that we can do to increase participation, particularly among young voters and voters who don't want to participate, to go out and vote in person. Those are the things we can do.
Curious for your views on RCV, ranked choice voting, which I support.
Yeah, look, I think I don't have a strong view one way or another on
Okay.
RCV. I understand the argument for it, particularly I think a runoff system is wasteful. So I think if you're going to have a system where you're going to want more than 50% of the people to elect the candidate, we should
Right.
do RCV rather than having a runoff election.
So for folks who may not be aware of what ranked choice voting is, it's really intuitive in my opinion. Here's my number one candidate. This is the person I really want to win. But if she or he doesn't win, I'm okay with number two. And then number three, not ideal, but blah, blah, blah. But you're expressing kind of your preferences. It's also called an instant runoff. So you don't have to come back and vote again. Closed versus open primaries. Virginia, you don't have to be registered with a party. In
Mhm.
Maryland, you do. And you have to be a Democrat to vote in a Democratic primary, and ditto with Republicans. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, I've always been a fan of open primaries because I think it allows more people who register as independents to participate in the primary process. And I think we've seen in all studies that a lot of independents actually do have views that align with either the Republicans or Democrats, but they just don't like to choose a
Yeah,
party. There are people who say,
yeah.
I don't want to affiliate myself so strongly with the party. I think it's better to try and get those folks in during the primary process and makes them more likely to vote in the general election as well.
I have brought legislation for years that I have not been able to move that I call ballot access, which allows unaffiliated voters to come in and affiliate and cast a primary ballot, but then they would be called a Democrat or Republican. They would need to affirmatively change back to unaffiliated if they wanted to. But I don't understand why a new voter would have more voter access than a lifelong unaffiliated Marylander. That doesn't
I
ever make
agree. And
sense
I
to me.
think your legislation is a good compromise that requires some step of affiliation, but maybe they're doing it when they're excited about a candidate as opposed to when they
Right.
have to register. And that seems
Which
like a
is
fair way
fine.
to do it.
And if
Exactly.
they come from another country, if you register with the wrong party, your family could be murdered. I mean, so
Yeah,
we have a lot of immigrants who may not, understand all that. Third
absolutely.
parties. There is conversation about a third party candidate running for president or in other elections. Impact on democracy. What do you think?
Yeah, I think our system is set up to be a two-party system, right? We have what the academics call first past the post, right? We have one winner
Mhm.
in single district or single race elections, which means that ultimately it's going to come down to one of two candidates winning. And so in such a system, third parties basically just play a spoiler role one way or the other. And I don't think we want to we're going to have a choiceless election for president between a Democrat and a Republican. Like that's going to be the case in the Senate and the House. And that's the choice. So if you're going to vote, you should vote for the Democrat or Republican, whoever you think is better to represent you. And the concern with the third party is they offer this, quote unquote, like, other option, but it's not really another option.
Right.
And I think the studies have shown, particularly with no labels, that it's going to hurt, Joe Biden more than the Republican candidate. So someone who
Right.
very much thinks that President Biden needs to be reelected to make sure that our democracy survives, these third-party efforts, I think, are a real hindrance. And I saw that happen in 2000 with Ralph Nader and Al Gore.
Right. Right. And we had Ross Perot in 92 when we had and just because someone has the last name of Kennedy doesn't mean they bring the values of a Kennedy. Just saying. You
Absolutely,
will learn more
absolutely,
about that. All right.
absolutely.
One of the coolest things I've ever gotten to do was go to Russia for the first free elections to the Duma, their state parliament, their state Congress, National Congress. Unfortunately, I will never go back to Russia, certainly not now. But have you done, as a national election lawyer, have you done international work on elections? And what do you think American elections can teach other countries? And what can we learn from other countries?
I have not had the opportunity to do international elections. It would be something I'd be absolutely fascinated in doing and doing some of the comparative system. It seems to me, just based on observing it, that there is a lot to be said about some of the parliamentary systems that are used in other countries where you essentially just have one election and that the one party wins, that party's leader is then the prime minister. And then they either do what they said they were going to do, and that either works or doesn't work. And then you have
Right.
accountability for that. I mean,
Right.
look, I think the reason our system is designed, and it's worked pretty darn well, we're still here after hundreds of years, was to make it a little bit harder to actually have one party or one set of folks in control of the government at any given time. And, that is a good barrier against certain bad things from happening. But I do think it frustrates the ability to get anything done. And I think that builds up a lot of bad will among
Yes.
voters in a sense of disillusionment. So I would love to, if there were ways to experiment to see how the parliamentary system would work. To me, that would be quite fascinating.
Interesting. All right. I just have one more type of questions before we get to our fast five.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things that we have seen an increasing trend is threats to our election workers. It is hard to recruit, retain, train, and retain election judges, poll workers, and election administrators. What's the secret sauce for addressing that? And is there anyone who's doing it well to protect
Yeah.
our and honor our election workers?
It is such an important job. Without our election workers, the election systems do not function. And it's such a difficult task. And a lot of them are doing it as volunteers or for little pay. So I think there are some groups out there that are doing an amazing job of helping to confront threats and violence. The States United is a group that's out there that's really doing important work on political violence. So I think, making sure that any threats that are made against election workers, God forbid anyone does anything that goes beyond a threat, that is just, severely punished in the same way that, threats against other government workers, police officers, et cetera, are punished more severely because you
Right.
need to protect that core essential parts of democracy. To me, we should have the same protections for election workers. We should make sure the pay is there so that we can actually
Yep.
attract and retain talent,
Yep.
and have more folks who are there permanently throughout the year. Like, let's make this something that people can do as a profession, so
Career
that
path.
there's a little bit more
Absolutely.
consistency. So I think those are really the things we can do.
Yeah. Well said. Good. Thank you. And I am bringing legislation about threats, so we
I
can
love
talk
it.
about that offline
It's great.
for next year's session. All right, John Berkon, election
Yes.
lawyer, partner at the
Yes.
Elias Group. It's time for your Fact Five.
All right.
Five
Hit
quick
me.
questions, five quick answers.
Great.
First, question number one. What's an election that you would love to have been involved with, either as a campaign worker or as an attorney, and any time in history?
I would say 1960, the John Kennedy versus Richard Nixon election, another incredibly close election that was contested with an exciting candidate at the front of it. That would have been a fun one to be part of.
Definitely. Question number two. Who's your favorite president? Someone you
I will go with
admire
Lincoln.
most.
I will go with Lincoln.
Anything more you want to say?
I think just I admire, to have kept the country together when things were at such risk. And as a lawyer, I find reading his writings on law and just the way in which he navigated problems in an incredibly nuanced way to be quite fascinating.
Nice.
And it's someone I always love reading.
Great. Question number three. What's the best advice you've ever gotten from a mentor of yours?
I think the best advice I've ever gotten from a mentor of mine is with respect to dealing with your clients. And the advice that was given is ultimately your clients want to feel good about their interactions with you. And I think that's always an important thing because people come to you when they're nervous about something, when they might have a problem. Maybe they're a little bit embarrassed about something they did and want your help and advice to do it. And just establishing that rapport and knowing that they can come to you and that you're not going to, give shame or anything like that, but you're there to help and not to judge, I thought was really sage advice. And I think it goes beyond lawyering. It's good advice for dealing with all the friends and family members in your life as well.
I love that. You've got two young kids, a son and a daughter. What's your favorite thing you like to do with them?
sports. We're like a diehard sports family. So we'll go out on my daughter plays softball, my son plays baseball. So that is something that we can all do together, both watching and playing sports. So that's something I grew up with, and continuing on.
Perfect. And question 5, John Berkon, what is your hidden secret superpower? What is a skill or talent you have, something you're really good at that most folks can't do?
I am able, I think, to tolerate chaos and able to bridge the gap between different groups of people who may not get along with one another. And so I think that has served me enormously well in politics, which is a chaotic world in which there are a lot
Yes.
of people who don't get along
Amen
with
to
one another.
that.
So I think that has unexpectedly served me well as I've gone through this.
Good for you. Well, thank you for what you do. Thank you for working to defend democracy, and maybe with a little bit of a thumb on the scale here for democracy for Democrats and progressive values. So
And thank
thank
you,
you for
Senator, for having me and all the work you do on these issues. I mean, you have just an exemplary record in Maryland of promoting these issues and getting so much work done. And it has made voting and elections run well better in our neighboring state here to Virginia. So we
I
appreciate it.
really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Good to
Excellent.
kibitz with you today. Stay well.
Thanks, Senator. Appreciate it.
Take care.